I woke up before the sun had fully risen, just like I had done for most of my life. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't comforting. It felt heavy, as if every room was holding onto words that had never been spoken. I lay there for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Then, without thinking, I whispered, "Good morning, Mom." The words came out before I remembered. She was gone. 3 months had passed since we buried my mother, but my heart had not learned to live without her. Every morning, I still expected to hear her soft footsteps in the kitchen. I still imagined the smell of fresh coffee drifting down the hallway. I still pictured her standing by the window, looking out at the garden she loved so much. Sometimes grief does that. It tricks you into believing nothing has changed. Then, in the smallest moment, reality comes back and reminds you that everything has. My name is Sarah. I am 56 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I knew my mother better than anyone else. I thought I understood why she smiled so gently. I thought I understood why she never argued, why she always chose peace over pride, and why she spent so much of her life listening instead of speaking. I was wrong. The greatest truth about my mother was hidden inside her silence. I didn't discover that truth while she was alive. I found it after she was gone. If I had known then what I know now, I would have asked different questions. I would have stayed longer during my visits. I would have looked into her eyes instead of assuming that a smile meant everything was fine. But life doesn't wait for us to become wise. Sometimes it teaches us only after the lesson can no longer change the ending. My mother was named Eleanor. Everyone who knew her described her in almost the same way. They called her kind, patient, gentle, and strong. She never spoke badly about anyone. She never complained about life's unfairness. Even when things became difficult, she found a way to smile, that quiet little smile that made everyone around her feel safe. As a child, I thought all mothers were like that. As I grew older, I realized they weren't. Some mothers filled every room with stories and laughter. Mine filled every room with peace. She spoke only when she felt her words truly mattered. She listened with her whole heart. If someone shared a problem, she never rushed to give advice. She simply sat beside them until they felt less alone. Looking back now, I wonder who ever sat beside her. Who listened to her? Who asked what she was carrying inside? I don't remember anyone doing that. Not even me. I grew up in a small white house at the edge of town. It wasn't large, and it certainly wasn't fancy, but it always felt warm. My father worked as a mechanic. Every evening, he came home with tired eyes and rough hands stained with grease. Before he did anything else, he washed up and walked straight into the kitchen where my mother was preparing dinner. Without saying a word, he kissed her forehead. She always smiled. Then he asked the same question. "How was your day, Ellie?" She would look at him for a moment before answering. It was a good day. He never doubted her answer. Neither did I. Now, I wonder how many times those words hid something much deeper. I was their only child, and because of that, our little family was very close. We ate dinner together every evening. My father told stories from work that always made me laugh. I talked endlessly about school, my friends, and whatever new dream had captured my imagination that week. My mother mostly listened. Sometimes my father would stop talking and look at her. "What do you think?" She would smile softly. "I think we're lucky." Lucky. That was her favorite word. She said we were lucky to have a home. Lucky to have food on the table. Lucky to have each other. At the time, I believe she simply appreciated life. Now, I wonder if she was trying to remind herself of those blessings because they helped her carry burdens she never shared. When I was little, I often followed her into the garden. She loved flowers more than anything. She knew the name of every plant and every season when they bloomed. She treated each flower as though it had its own personality. One afternoon, I asked her why some flowers opened quickly while others took so long. She smiled and gently touched the petals of a rose. "You can't rush a flower," she said. "It blooms when it's ready." I nodded, even though I didn't fully understand. Years later, I realized people are much the same. Some hearts open easily. Others spend a lifetime staying closed. My mother belonged to the second kind. She loved deeply, but she rarely spoke about what she felt. If something hurt her, she carried it quietly. If something frightened her, she faced it alone. If she cried, she did it where no one could see. At least that was what I believed. I honestly cannot remember seeing my mother cry when I was growing up. Not once. I saw her laugh. I saw her smile. I saw her comfort everyone else. But tears? Never. As a child, I thought that meant she never needed comforting herself. Children don't always notice the hidden parts of their parents' lives. We grow up believing they are somehow stronger than ordinary people. We forget they carry fears, disappointments, and broken dreams just like everyone else. Life moved gently through the years. I finished school, then college. Eventually, I accepted a job in another city. The day I packed my suitcase, my mother helped me fold every shirt with the same careful hands that had buttoned my school uniform years before. Neither of us said very much. My father hugged me so tightly I could hardly breathe. My mother simply adjusted the collar of my jacket. "You'll be fine," she said. "I know you will." Those were the last words she spoke before I climbed onto the bus. As it pulled away, I looked back through the window. Dad waved with both hands. Mom stood quietly beside him. She smiled. Then they slowly disappeared behind the trees. I had no idea how precious that ordinary moment would become. The years passed faster than I expected. Work became busy. I got married. Then came children of my own. Life filled itself with responsibilities that seemed urgent every single day. I still called my parents every Sunday. Dad always answered first. Mom waited patiently beside him. Our conversations were simple. She asked if I was eating well. She asked about the children. She reminded me not to work too hard. Every phone call ended the same way. "I love you. I love you too." Back then, those words felt enough. Today, they feel painfully small. There were so many other things I should have asked. Were you happy? Did you ever feel lonely? What dreams did you leave behind? What scared you? Did you ever wish your life had been different? Those questions never crossed my mind. I believed there would always be another Sunday, another birthday, another Christmas dinner, another chance. Life has a quiet way of proving us wrong. One autumn, my father became ill. At first, everyone thought he was simply tired. He had worked hard for decades without slowing down. But the doctors soon discovered something far more serious. The treatments began. Hospital visits became part of our weekly routine. Through it all, my mother remained calm. She sat beside his bed every single day. She held his hand. She read to him when he couldn't sleep. She smiled whenever he opened his eyes. I remember thinking how incredibly strong she was. I admired her strength. Now I realize I misunderstood it. Sometimes what looks like strength is simply love refusing to leave someone's side, even while quietly breaking apart inside. When my father's illness grew worse, the rhythm of our family changed in ways none of us expected. The hospital became a place that felt almost as familiar as home. I learned the sound of the nurse's footsteps in the hallway. I learned which chair in his room was the most comfortable for long nights. Most of all, I watched my mother sit beside him every single day without asking for anything in return. She never complained about being tired. She never talked about how afraid she was. If someone asked how she was doing, she smiled gently and said, "I'm all right." People believed her. I believed her too. Looking back now, I realized that my mother had spent her whole life protecting other people from her pain. She carried it so quietly that even those closest to her couldn't hear it. The day my father passed away was peaceful. The room was still. The morning sun shone through the window, making everything seem almost too beautiful for such a heartbreaking moment. My mother held his hand until the very end. She leaned close, whispered something only he could hear, and kissed his forehead one last time. I stood only a few feet away. I wanted to ask what she had said, but the question stayed inside me. Some silences begin with words we never speak. After the funeral, friends and neighbors filled our home with kindness. They brought warm meals, flowers, and gentle hugs. For a little while, the house felt full again. Then, one by one, everyone returned to their own lives. The quiet remained. I worried about my mother living alone, so I called her more often. Sometimes I visited for the weekend, bringing my husband and our children. She always welcomed us with the same warm smile and a table full of food. She acted as though nothing had changed. She laughed when the grandchildren laughed. She listened to their stories. She baked their favorite cookies. Anyone watching would have believed she was doing just fine. But every now and then, I noticed something small. She would glance toward my father's empty chair before sitting down herself. She would pause in the hallway outside their bedroom. Sometimes, while washing the dishes, she would stop for just a second and stare out the kitchen window. When I asked what she was thinking about, she simply smiled. Oh, nothing important. I accepted that answer every time. Now I wish I hadn't. One Saturday afternoon, I arrived earlier than usual. I let myself in with the spare key she had given me years before. The house was quiet. I found her in the living room, sitting in my father's old armchair. She wasn't reading. She wasn't watching television. She was simply holding one of his sweaters in her lap. When she heard me, she quickly folded it and placed it beside her. I didn't hear you come in, she said. I'm sorry, I replied. I didn't mean to surprise you. She smiled. It's all right. Neither of us mentioned the sweater. Instead, we talked about the weather, the garden, and how quickly the children were growing. It was easier that way. At least, that's what I told myself. As the months passed, I noticed that my mother became even quieter. Not in a sad way, just distant. She still cared for everyone around her. She still remembered birthdays. She still baked pies for the neighbors. But there was a part of her that seemed to live somewhere none of us could reach. One evening, after dinner, I offered to wash the dishes while she dried them. For several minutes, we worked in comfortable silence. Then I asked, Mom, are you lonely? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she carefully dried another plate before placing it into the cabinet. Finally, she looked at me. Everyone gets lonely sometimes. It wasn't really an answer, but I didn't ask again. I simply nodded and changed the subject. Today, that moment returns to me more often than almost any other. She had opened the door just a little. I was the one who walked away. As winter arrived, my visits became less frequent. Work was demanding. My children had their own busy lives. There always seemed to be something that couldn't wait. Whenever I apologized for not visiting sooner, my mother smiled. Don't worry about me, she would say. I'm doing just fine. Those words became so familiar that I stopped questioning them. One snowy afternoon, she called me unexpectedly. She almost never called first. We talked for nearly an hour, mostly about ordinary things. The weather, the neighbors, my grandchildren. Just before hanging up, she became unusually quiet. I've been thinking about something, she said softly. What is it, Mom? Oh, it's nothing. You can tell me. She laughed gently. Maybe another time. I smiled and told her we'd talk soon. Neither of us knew there wouldn't be another time. For weeks afterward, I kept wondering what she had wanted to say. But life became busy again, and the questions slowly slipped into the background. I had no idea that my mother's greatest secret was waiting quietly inside that little house. And I had no idea that the truth behind her silence would soon change everything I believed about the woman who had spent her entire life putting everyone else before herself. One rainy afternoon, my phone rang while I was making lunch. I almost let it go to voicemail because my hands were covered in flour. Something inside me told me to answer. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Harper. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the worry behind it. Sarah, she said softly, your mother isn't feeling well. The doctor is here. I think you should come. I didn't ask any questions. I grabbed my keys and left the house. The drive felt longer than it ever had before. Every red light seemed to last forever. My mind kept telling me that everything would be all right. My mother had always been strong. She had always found a way through difficult days. I wanted to believe this would be another one. When I arrived, the front door was already open. The house was strangely quiet. The doctor met me in the hallway. He gave me a kind smile. The kind people wear when they have difficult news, but don't want to make it harder than it already is. She's resting, he said. Go spend some time with her. I walked slowly toward her bedroom. She looked so small lying there. Her silver hair rested gently against the pillow. Her hands, the same hands that had held mine when I was a little girl, now seemed thin and fragile. When she saw me, she smiled. There you are, she whispered. I'm here, Mom. I sat beside her and held her hand. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt familiar. It was the same silence that had lived in our family for years. Only now I was beginning to understand that silence can carry love just as easily as words. After a while, she squeezed my hand. "I've made you worry." "You don't have to think about that," I replied. She smiled again. "I've always thought about everyone else." There was something different in her voice. It sounded tired. Not only tired from illness, tired from carrying something for a very long time. She looked toward the window before speaking again. "There's a wooden box in my closet." I frowned. "A box?" She nodded slowly. "When the time is right, I want you to open it." "Why not now?" She closed her eyes for a moment. "Because I don't think I can explain everything." Those words frightened me. I wanted to ask what she meant. I wanted to ask what was inside. Instead, I simply held her hand tighter. "I love you," I whispered. "I know," she answered. "And I love you more than you'll ever understand." They were beautiful words. At the time, I thought they were simply a mother's way of saying goodbye. I didn't realize they were also asking for forgiveness. 2 days later, my mother slipped away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was simple, just as she would have wanted. Friends filled the little church with flowers and quiet memories. They spoke about her kindness, her patience, and the way she always made people feel welcome. Everyone described the same woman, the gentle woman, the quiet woman, the strong woman. As I listened, I realized something. Not one person stood up and said they truly knew what my mother had carried inside her heart. Perhaps none of us had. After everyone went home, I stayed behind in the old house. For the first time in my life, it felt completely empty. The clock still ticked in the hallway. The curtain still moved with the evening breeze. Her favorite cup still sat beside the sink. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet nothing was. I remembered the wooden box. My heart began to beat faster. I walked into her bedroom. The closet smelled faintly of lavender, just as it always had. On the top shelf sat a small wooden box with brass corners. It wasn't locked. I carried it carefully to the kitchen table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Part of me wanted to leave it closed forever. Another part knew I couldn't. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly folded letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. There were old photographs I had never seen before. A tiny baby bracelet. A dried white flower pressed between the pages of a notebook. And on top of everything else, an envelope with my name written in my mother's careful handwriting. "My dear Sarah." Just seeing those words filled my eyes with tears. I opened the letter slowly. The paper was worn, as though she had written it long ago and read it many times before deciding to leave it for me. The first line stopped my breathing. "If you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to tell you the truth while I was alive." I wiped away my tears and kept reading. "You always believed I was a quiet woman because that was simply my nature. Part of that is true. But my silence was also a choice. A choice I made many years before you were born. My hands began to shake. There are things I protected you from. There are stories I buried because I wanted your childhood to be filled with peace instead of pain." I leaned back in my chair. Every memory of my mother suddenly felt different. Every smile, every pause, every quiet answer. "Your father knew everything," the letter continued. "He carried this secret with me because he believed love sometimes means protecting the people we cherish, even when it comes at a cost." I could hardly breathe. What secret? What had they hidden for all these years? I turned the page. Between the sheets of paper, a photograph slipped onto the table. It showed my mother as a young woman. She looked no older than 20. She was standing beside a little girl with bright eyes and curly hair. The child couldn't have been more than 4 years old. I stared at the picture. I had never seen that little girl before. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, were 6 words that changed everything. "My beautiful Anna, I miss you every day." My heart pounded. Who was Anna? Why had my mother never spoken that name? Why had she hidden this photograph for decades? For the first time in my life, I realized my mother's silence had never been empty. It had been protecting a lifetime of sorrow. And I knew that before I could truly grieve the mother I had lost, I would first have to discover the woman she had been before I ever knew her. I sat at the kitchen table for what felt like hours, unable to move. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and the old clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm. Everything around me looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore. The photograph lay beside my mother's letter. I picked it up again. The young woman smiling at the camera was clearly my mother. Her smile was brighter than the one I had known all my life. There was a light in her eyes that I had never seen before. Beside her stood the little girl, Anna. I traced the child's tiny face with my finger. Who was she? Why had my mother spent her entire life hiding this picture? With trembling hands, I continued reading the letter. Sarah, before you judge me, I ask only one thing. Please read every word. My silence was never because I didn't trust you. It was because I never wanted you to carry the pain that belonged to me. I stopped again. Tears blurred the ink. For the first time, I realized my mother had never been protecting herself. She had been protecting me. I took a deep breath and kept reading. When I was very young, long before I met your father, I fell in love with a kind man named Daniel. We dreamed about a simple life together. We had very little money, but we believed love would always be enough. Then our daughter was born, Anna. The name suddenly felt real. She was the most beautiful child I had ever seen. She laughed easily. She loved butterflies and yellow flowers. Every morning she ran into my arms before I could even finish making breakfast. As I read those words, I could almost hear my mother's voice. Not the quiet voice I had always known. A younger voice. A happier voice. Our happiness lasted only 4 years. My heart tightened. One winter, Anna became very sick. The doctors tried everything they could, but medicine could only do so much in those days. I held her hand until she took her last breath. I covered my mouth as tears streamed down my face. I couldn't imagine the pain. No mother should ever have to bury her child. No wonder my mother's smile had changed. No wonder silence had become her closest companion. The letter continued. After Anna died, I stopped speaking very much. Friends tried to comfort me. Family told me time would heal everything. But time never brought my little girl back. People slowly stopped asking how I felt. They believed I had become strong. The truth was different. I simply learned to cry where no one could see me. Those words shattered something inside me. My whole life, I had admired my mother's strength. Now I understood what it had cost her. She had carried unbearable grief without asking anyone to carry it with her. I kept reading. Several years later, I met your father. A small smile appeared through my tears. The first thing I told him was about Anna. I wanted him to know that part of my heart would always belong to the little girl I had lost. He never asked me to forget her. Instead, he told me something I will never forget. Love does not end because someone leaves this world. It simply learns a new way to stay. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like my father. Gentle, patient, kind. No wonder they loved each other so deeply. When you were born, Sarah, I was terrified. I looked at the page. Terrified? I loved you from the moment I held you, but I was afraid. I was afraid that if I loved another child with all my heart, I might lose you too. My chest ached. For many months, I watched you while you slept just to make sure you were breathing. Every fever frightened me. Every scraped knee reminded me how quickly life can change. I remembered all those moments. The way she rushed to comfort me. The way she checked on me before going to bed. The way she hugged me a little longer than other mothers seemed to. Back then, I thought that was simply love. Now I realized it was love mixed with fear. A fear she had never spoken aloud. The letter continued. I promised myself that you would grow up with laughter instead of sadness. I wanted you to remember your childhood as peaceful. That is why I rarely spoke about the years before you were born. I didn't want my grief to become your burden. I finally understood. She hadn't hidden Anna because she wanted to erase her. She had hidden the pain. There was a difference. A very important difference. Inside the box were more letters. Some were written by my father. Others were written by my mother, but never sent to anyone. One letter was addressed simply to Anna. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. My sweet girl, it began. Today Sarah started school. She reminds me of you in so many little ways. She laughs with her whole heart, just like you did. Sometimes I feel guilty for smiling again. Then I remember that if you were here, you would want me to smile. I hope somehow you know that your little sister is growing into a wonderful young woman. I couldn't stop crying. My mother had been talking to Anna all those years. Not because she couldn't let go, but because love had never left her heart. I looked through the rest of the box. There were birthday cards she had written every year for Anna but never mailed. Tiny drawings, pressed flowers, even a small knitted sweater that had belonged to her. Each item had been carefully protected for decades. She hadn't forgotten, not for a single year. As evening settled outside, I realized something that changed my own heart. All my life, I believed my mother was silent because she had nothing to say. The truth was exactly the opposite. She had so much to say that no words ever felt big enough. Her silence wasn't empty. It was filled with memories. It was filled with love. It was filled with the little girl's laughter that only she could still hear. For the first time since her funeral, I looked around the old kitchen and smiled through my tears. I finally knew who my mother really was. Not just the quiet woman everyone admired. Not just the gentle mother who always smiled. She was also a grieving mother who had learned to keep living after losing a child. She had carried 2 daughters in her heart every single day. One she held in her arms, the other she held in her memories. And somehow, she loved us both with the same endless, beautiful heart. The weeks that followed felt different from anything I had ever experienced. I was grieving my mother, but I was also getting to know her for the very first time. Every letter I read, every photograph I held, and every small keepsake I found inside that wooden box showed me another part of the woman she had been. I realized that our parents often give us only the chapters they believe we need. They quietly keep the painful pages to themselves, hoping to protect us from the weight they carry. My mother had done exactly that. She had never wanted me to grow up feeling sorry for her. She wanted me to grow up feeling loved. And I had. One Saturday morning, I walked into her garden. It was early spring, and the flowers were beginning to bloom again. The roses she had cared for so faithfully were opening one by one, just as they had every year. I remembered something she had once told me when I was a little girl. You can't rush a flower. It blooms when it's ready. Back then, I thought she was teaching me about gardening. Now I understood she had been teaching me about life. Some truths bloom only when our hearts are ready to receive them. I spent the entire afternoon working in her garden. I pulled weeds, watered the flowers, and trimmed the old branches just as she used to do. For the first time since losing her, I felt close to her again. Not because I imagined her standing beside me, but because I finally understood her heart. Before leaving that afternoon, I placed a small white flower beneath the old maple tree at the edge of the yard. I whispered 2 names. My mother, Anna. It felt right to speak them together. For so many years, Anna had existed only in my mother's memories. Now she lived in mine as well. She was my sister. I had never met her. I had never heard her laugh. But somehow I already loved her. A few days later, I gathered my own children around the dining table. They noticed the photographs spread across the table. One of them picked up the picture of my mother holding little Anna. "Who's this little girl?" my daughter asked softly. I smiled through my tears. "She's your aunt." They looked surprised. "We never knew." "I know," I answered gently. "Neither did I." That evening, I told them everything my mother had written in her letters. Not every painful detail, just enough for them to understand who their grandmother truly was. When I finished, the room was quiet. Finally, my youngest son spoke. "Grandma must have been very brave." I nodded. She was, but she was also very sad. Those simple words touched my heart. For the first time, I realized that strength and sadness can live together. One does not erase the other. My mother had taught me that without ever saying it. Over the following months, I found myself becoming more open with the people I loved. When something hurt me, I talked about it. When I missed someone, I said their name. When I felt overwhelmed, I stopped pretending everything was fine. I didn't want silence to become the language of my heart. Not because silence is wrong, but because I had learned how easily it can hide pain that deserves to be shared. Sometimes my daughter would call just to ask how I was doing. Instead of saying, "I'm fine," out of habit, I began answering honestly. Some days I missed my mother terribly. Some days I smiled while remembering her. Some days I cried. And all of those days were all right. Healing, I discovered, isn't about forgetting. It's about learning to carry love without letting grief become your only companion. One afternoon, I returned to the little cemetery where my parents rested side by side. The wind moved gently through the trees. Birds sang somewhere nearby. Everything felt peaceful. I stood there for a long time without speaking. Then I smiled. "Mom," I whispered, "I finally understand. I understand why you were quiet. I understand why you smiled, even when your heart was breaking. I understand why Dad loved you so deeply." The breeze brushed across my face, as if the world itself had paused for just a moment. I wish I had asked more questions. I wish I had listened more carefully. But thank you for trusting me with your story. I'll never let it be forgotten. As I turned to leave, I looked back one last time. For years, I had believed my mother's silence was a wall between us. Now I knew it had never been a wall. It had been a bridge. She simply didn't know how to cross it with words. That night, I placed the wooden box on a shelf in my own home. Not hidden away. Not locked inside a closet. It had become part of our family story. My grandchildren sometimes ask about the old photographs. I tell them about Eleanor, the gentle woman who loved flowers, baked fresh bread every Saturday, and always made room at her table for anyone who needed a meal. Then I tell them about Anna, the little girl who loved butterflies and yellow flowers. I tell them that love never disappears just because someone is gone. It changes. It grows quieter. It finds a place inside our memories. And if we let it, it teaches us to love the people still beside us even more deeply. There is one lesson I carry with me every single day now. Never assume that a quiet person has an empty heart. Some of the deepest love lives in silence. Some of the greatest pain hides behind the gentlest smile. And some of the most important stories are never told unless someone is willing to ask, listen, and stay. If your mother is still with you, sit beside her while you can. Ask about her childhood. Ask about her dreams. Ask about the days that shaped her before you were born. Listen without rushing. Listen without looking at the clock. Because one day, the questions you never asked may become the heaviest thing you carry. I learned that lesson too late. But thanks to one old wooden box, a bundle of faded letters, and a mother's quiet courage, I also learned something beautiful. Love does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it hides inside a lifetime of silence, hoping that one day someone will finally understand. Now, when I wake each morning, I still find myself whispering, "Good morning, Mom." The difference is that those words no longer fill me only with sorrow. They also fill me with gratitude. Because I was blessed to be loved by a woman whose heart was far bigger than her silence ever allowed the world to see. And as long as I remember her story and share it with those who come after me, neither my mother nor my sister Anna will ever truly be gone. Their love lives on. In me, in my children, and in every quiet moment when I choose to listen a little longer, love a little deeper, and never take another heartbeat with the people I cherish for granted. That is the truth behind my mother's silence. And it is a truth that will stay with me for the rest of my life.